Many believe life as we know it has changed irrevocably, and that in this seismic shift lies an opportunity to turn things around, improve our world, and make life better for the majority, especially in poor countries. It is time to reboot Nigeria. This is Pivotal. According to the latest data from the World Poverty Clock, Nigeria has over 70 million people, representing 33% of the population, who are currently living in extreme poverty. Other sources, like Business Insider Africa, put the number at a little over 50% of the population. This at a time when food production across the African continent is expected to decline by at least 20% as a result of fertilizer shortages due to the Russia-Ukrainian war. This is according to the Africa Development Bank. Given that the continent is still reeling from the economic difficulties caused by the COVID pandemic, the prognosis for food security, particularly in a place like Nigeria, where insecurity has also hampered farming in a substantial way, is not good. Prices of the most basic commodities are rising, with the National Bureau of Statistics putting food inflation figures at 17.2%. But this is not the only problem facing Nigeria. We appear to be spending more than we earn. A little over 6 trillion of our 17 trillion 2022 budget is to be funded by debt. And mind you, the bulk of expenditure in that budget is, ironically, debt servicing and other recurrent expenditure. The value of the naira continues to decline, not surprisingly really, given that the country is not very productive. And then we have a mass of people who are unemployed, 33%, or underemployed, 22.8%. So what exactly is the state of the health of Nigeria's economy? Is the country broke? And if this is the case, what does it all mean in practical terms, particularly for citizens, for social cohesion, and for government? And can anything be done about it? Or is it too late? These are the questions I'm hoping we can get answers to today with the help of respected economist and newspaper columnist, Mr. Okpeyemi Agbaje, who joins me in the Pivotal studio. Mr. Agbaje, thank you so much for coming to Pivotal.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for saying yes and coming. I think we should just start with a really simple question that I think might help to sort of stage the conversation properly. Is Nigeria broke?
I think Nigeria is in very dire financial and economic conditions, and you've put the case rather clearly before your audience. First of all, you mentioned $6 to $7 trillion of deficit in the budget, and we're adding about 3 trillion to the budget to finance subsidies.
Four.
Yes,
I'm told, yeah.
Yes. So, and of course that means the subsidy, the debt will rise in the budget. Currently, we service our existing debt with, depending on who your source is, anywhere between 80 to 95% of current income. So essentially, we're borrowing to service existing debt, borrowing to finance subsidies, borrowing to pay salaries and overheads, and yes, a little portion of it to build infrastructure.
But a tiny portion of it.
A tiny portion of
right.
it, the smallest portion of it. On the other hand, if you look at the GDP side, how's the economy doing? You're barely growing. We had 4 and 3% growth in the last 2 quarters of 2021, but anybody who understands economics knows that that's because of what economists call base effects.
What does that mean?
Which means that, we calculate many of these things year on year.
Right.
So for instance, inflation figures and GDP figures are calculated year on year. So if I tell you Q4 in 2021 was 6% growth, it's in comparison to Q4 in 2020.
So in actual fact, what I'm hearing you say is that despite people like me who are amateurs and don't understand these numbers, we sort of see a growth and we're excited about it. In reality, it may not be real growth. It is growth vis-a-vis what was happening in the same quarter the year before.
And that was a recession. So that was a 6% recession. Right. So when we had a 5% growth overall, we're almost going back to sort of, we're just going back to
status quo.
-1. Actually.
-1.
So we're barely struggling to grow. In 2023, if we see real growth, we will now know that because we got back to zero, we now have some real growth. So we're not growing in terms of what's happening with the economy.
But is that surprising to you? I mean, there's some of us who've always known that there is something almost like a magician trick when people talk about Nigeria being the sort of biggest economy and all that. If we kind of look at the fact that we're not a productive people in the real sense of the word, we'd always felt that there was something really weird about us carrying that tag on the basis of just, our numbers, our GDP, etc., etc.
You have a point, but let me, and I appreciate that we should make this understandable. Up till 2014-15, we were doing about 6 to 7% real GDP growth. The main peril in our growth then was it was driven by and large by rising oil prices.
Right.
And an emerging non-oil economy. Historically, if you say before the 80s, agriculture was almost 40% of that output. Not surprisingly. Everybody in the country was more or less a farmer across from the north to the east to the west. Farming was the most significant activity in the country. It's still the most important activity in the country. Today, that 40% is down to around 20%, 22%, 20 whatever percent, 24, 25, depending on quarter changing. But the income from farming does not go to the government of Nigeria.
No.
It goes to each farmer, most of whom do not pay tax. On the other hand, there was a sector back in the 70s and 80s called oil and gas, crude oil and gas actually. That was 20% of that output, but more or less, most of that 20% went to the government of Nigeria. It went to the government of Nigeria both in terms of neither income from taxation, petroleum profit taxes and all of that, and foreign currency export.
From the sale of crude.
As a matter of fact, where you get to exports, the export income of Nigeria, those oil earnings represented 95% of our export earnings. That's where we came from. Today, those export earnings, depending on, given that all of what has happened with oil and all, they're down to somewhere 75, whatever. So when we say our GDP, it's not an oil-dominated GDP. Today, it's agriculture 20%, trade 10%, real estate 10%, service. Put all the services together, it's about 30-40%. So now we are at a position in which our domestic economy is diversified. if you look at that structure of output of goods and services. Quite a lot going on. Arts, entertainment, real estate, financial services, telecoms and services, ICT, all of those diversified things are going on. But our income from the forex side remains dominated by oil. And today we have done some kind of diversification. I speak in ironically, because we've diversified now, it's now oil and borrowing.
Right. That's how you say it.
So foreign income comes from oil and borrowing. Our government revenue comes from oil and borrowing, but our domestic economy is a little bit diversified.
Okay. So to go back to that first question, and because I'm conscious of time, there's a lot to get through. You've not said a clear yes to the question if Nigeria is broke.
I think
but based on what you described, we are broke.
We are broke.
What does it mean for us in the sort of immediate term, but also perhaps, long term?
Okay, so in the short term, there's this news around Sri Lanka. It's a good takeoff point in response to. Sri Lanka has gone broke. It cannot pay its debts. That story, if you read it, reads very much like Nigeria, except for one significant factor. The global financial system still looks to debt to GDP.
Right.
To be sure that you are broke.
Right.
Your level of debts over your GDP.
Right.
Now for Nigeria, that is still quite healthy. If you take our level of debts over the gross domestic product of the country, it's still quite exalted, 6%.
And I need you to sort of explain that, because every time I've spoken to economists such as yourself, they keep telling me things like borrowing in itself is not a problem, and that actually countries are expected to borrow. Right? Businesses are expected to borrow. That what makes our situation bad is what the borrowing goes into.
And how the
borrowing is financed. Exactly, all those things. So I need to have that clarity to understand why, even though we seem to be doing all the wrong things, and I think you will explain it better, somehow in the eyes of the global financial institutions, they may not declare us bankrupt.
Precisely because our debt to GDP ratios are still quite healthy. Now, why is our debt to GDP healthy, whereas our debt servicing over revenue is problematic? Because our economy, like I explained earlier, is quite diversified, it's quite large. But the revenues for government are coming from only one source, which is like today, like 5% of the economy, the oil sector.
Right.
Our revenues are coming, government revenues are basically coming small from taxation, very below the normal rate of taxation in most countries, including our peers, but we earn our revenues from selling oil.
How come, again, lenders seem to keep wanting to give money to Nigeria?
If Nigeria was an individual approaching a bank, he would not be able to borrow. Because a bank, I've spent decades in banking, a bank will not lend you money if you are using more than 33% of your income
to service.
Like I said, we're approaching 100%.
Right.
So the only reason lenders can continue to lend to Nigeria is, one, like I said earlier, they focus on our debts over our GDP, which that GDP includes many other things that don't deliver revenues to the government. And secondly, they focus on revenue from oil, which they make a short-term calculation and say, will they be able to pay this Eurobond back next year from their revenues from oil? If the answer is yes. Now, one of the things I've said recently is that while lenders can look at us erroneously, we should look at ourselves
honestly.
We should be honest with ourselves. And that if we wanted to assess our debt capacity, we should focus on our revenues and the debt service obligations we have. And that would tell us that we're approaching crisis point.
Okay, so
however, we should then focus our efforts on expanding our revenues in the short and medium term.
Okay, so not necessarily shrink borrowing as such, because in your view, we need the money, right?
We need the money provided it is not for subsidies, salaries and overheads, and debt service.
But that's precisely what we're doing. And we will go into whether our situation is solely, caused by us, which many people believe is, or whether, sometimes the government likes to sort of make excuses that there are external factors that are causing that. And we'll have that conversation right after this break. You are watching Pivotal, and we're talking the Nigerian economy with Economist, Mr. Opeyemi Agbaje. Don't go away. Welcome back to Pivotal, where I am in conversation with the economist, Mr. Opeyemi Agbaje, on the state of the Nigerian economy and what impact our issues are likely to have on regular Nigerians. Mr. Agbaje, before the break, we sort of spent a little bit time understanding where the pressures are, where the problems are. Now, people in government like to sometimes point to the impact of the COVID pandemic. The more recent Russia-Ukrainian war and the impact it's had on agricultural produce, in particular wheat, which we import, but also fertilizer. How much of our problems are self-inflicted, and how much of them are sort of, dependent on sort of global happenings? So
there's no doubt that we are subject to global economic and financial developments and geopolitical factors such as Russia, Ukraine, the energy implications and the food implications such as COVID and those things. And even before that, let me say something. I argue that Nigeria has not fully recovered from global economic and financial developments going back, in fact, to the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009.
That far back.
And then the 2014-15 oil price collapse, and then COVID, and then Russia, Ukraine. Because policy responses have been inadequate. So yes, there are global developments, but take in particular 2014-15. With due respect, our policy response. Let me take the most obvious case. Our policy responses were completely inappropriate, delayed, and therefore they made the situation worse. Let me take the most obvious case.
What does that is? Are we not making a nonsense of the new petroleum industry legislation that we've just signed amid a lot of celebration, given that it took 20 years, if we are continuing to focus on paying? So we're ignoring our own laws.
Exactly. We're ignoring the law, we're ignoring economic rationality and borrowing essentially 3 to 4 trillion naira, which is also partly financing corruption because the figures don't make sense.
Right.
In terms of
so a large chunk of the subsidy is actually going into private pockets.
Yes.
We can say that authoritatively.
We're absolutely certain, because it doesn't make sense. We also know that a large part of the subsidy goes to Benin, goes to Niger, goes to Cameroon, goes to all our neighbors. In terms of
we're subsidizing the whole of West Africa.
Exactly, but they don't enjoy the full subsidy because the people who take it there then sell it to them at their own market price. So the pocket profit then goes to some private people who have the ability, the connections,
So it's not even as if the NNPC is using that to recover some of what it sort of spends subsidizing Nigeria, which would have made a bit of sense, right?
NNPC and then go and sell across the borders at the economic prices. And the disparity in those prices mean that you need angels not to take advantage. Of those things.
Okay, so let me ask you this. I mean, it's a gloomy picture. It doesn't look great. And then you're sort of watching events globally, and you're hearing that countries like China, who sort of been, if you like, the masters of sort of global economy over the last, 10 years. If you look at sort of their growth, their productivity, sort of they've become big hitters.
Taking people out of
poverty, all of the things they've done, the things they've built, and all of that. And you're hearing that China may actually face a recession, as well as a few other European countries. People are predicting this based again on the impact of the Russia-Ukrainian war, as well as in a few places, China has also seen small spikes in sort of COVID-related infections and all of that.
In March 2022 report that my firm, RTC Advisory Issues, was titled, "Are We Headed into Another Recession?" That's Nigeria, not talking about
other places.
And like I said, we had not recovered. We just got back to zero. We have had 4 rolling crises. I go back to 2009.
Yes.
We've had 2009, 2015, which resulted. 2009 was the only one that didn't result in a recession.
Right.
Because we had a lot of money accumulated under Obasanjo.
And some would argue good managers too.
Yes. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala and Co and all and Soludo and so. So, but 2014-15 resulted in the 2016 recession. COVID resulted in the last recession. So we haven't fully recovered. And then we now have particularly the energy crisis and the impact on production from the cost of diesel. The times, you see, we misapply subsidies. We should apply subsidies when there are.
So this would have been the time if we had saved money to then say
production.
Manufacturers.
Because how could this business survive with a 400% increase in the cost of diesel? This would have been an appropriate case where you went to your National Assembly, you presented the arguments for some legislation, a budgetary support, and you subsidized the cost of diesel. But we've wasted those subsidies on petrol in times when really
we didn't need to.
We really didn't have to. I've written off now till the end of the transition. Politicians are not going to take
hard
economic decisions, unfortunately, until May 2023, or perhaps until April after the elections or March.
So if Abuja is watching this and listening, and as an expert, if you sort of wanted to sort of say to them, look, these are the quick wins that you can do in order to sort of mind the gap for us, so that the next set of managers hopefully will come in and have the ability to do the right thing. What should those things be?
We need to focus aggressively on the revenue situation first. Now, do we have the will to get more realistic numbers on subsidy consumption, even if we don't have the will to remove the subsidy in an election period?
Okay, so cut down the corruption, please.
On the corruption, and possibly reduce the subsidies by half.
Right.
That's
already 2 trillion, yes.
That's a quick win. Can we look at government itself? Even in Ghana, they're looking at cost of governance and cutting it down by 30% and all of that. So
instead of 10 cars in your convoy.
Exactly. So can we look at government and drastically cut it down? And this, I'm talking drastically, because where it was by far than Ghana or anywhere else. So, but in the end, what we need are major structural reforms around ending unproductive and wasteful subsidies, ending the massive growth in government expenditure, restoring the budget to the rational structure in which the current expenditure is not more than 60% of spending, and capital expenditure is as a target, because now it's almost an impossibility given where we are today. But those are the type of targets that we need to set for ourselves. And then finding a system for getting private capital into infrastructure.
Mr. Agbaje, thank you so much for coming in and for helping me sort of simplify what is going on with the Nigerian economy for the majority of our listeners. I'm not quite sure that the people in Abuja will necessarily listen, but all we can do is keep trying. Thank you so much for coming in. And that's it for this edition of the program. Thank you to all of you who joined us. Join us again next month for another.